think I'll crack on. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Claire. Should I stand you as well? Right, okay, so the title, the least title I had was The Truth About Immigration, Why Ukip and the Right Are Lying. And it's sort of, God, in a way it's kind of annoying to have to go through this, but I do want to go through the list of probably 3 things that you get about immigration. You get it absolutely all over the place, and you get whispers of it. And mind UKIP, in some ways UKIP are, they're a problem, but they're not a principal problem here. In some ways, the principal problem starts to appear around the Labour Party, I think, and around people who ought to know better. That if I pick up, actually I don't buy The Guardian, but if I read it online, and that's partly the Guardian's current difficulties, I suppose, that no one's buying it anymore, but if you end up reading online John Harris in The Guardian, this great liberal newspaper, making a series of pretty daft claims about how the world works, to which the average wage in this country is, whatever the average wage is at the minute, off the top of my head, £1,000 what is it, a month or something like this, some figure that's not particularly high. But then he goes, oh, the average wage in Bulgaria is £300 a month, the average wage in Bulgaria, in Romania, £300 a month, and that's why people are moving here. Now, leaving aside the fact that John Harris, in his enthusiasm for trying to construct a sort of economic case for why immigration is bad and why these people coming over here, taking our jobs, cutting our wages, etc., is in fact what Labour should be saying about it. There's an obvious sort of economic illiteracy here. And yes, average wages are lower in Bulgaria. It is a poorer place, but of course everything costs less in Bulgaria or Romania, so you can't just compare what you get paid in Bulgaria to what you get paid here and say, oh my God, the gap is so big, you may as well abandon your entire family and move all the way to the other end of the continent to try and find work here. It's just nonsense. It's nonsense to have somebody who's claiming to be a Labour supporter, and you get some MPs, there's the guy up in Birmingham who's trying this on as well. Well, we've got to admit that immigration is a problem. The Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, just the other day, we need to start talking about limiting benefits to people moving here for their first 2 years. This continual refrain you get that, we're just not allowed to talk about immigration. I'm sorry, you pick up pretty much any newspaper, look at any of their websites, see any television news programme, and frankly all you're getting at the minute is some story or another about immigration in one form or another. What was the Express and the Telegraph and the Mail, and I don't doubt a few of the other ones, but those are 3 I saw today, leading on the story that Britain is handing out more passports than any other EU country. That's how the Express was trying to spin it. Of course, it turns out we're handing out these passports to people from India and Pakistan. In other words, these places in the world that we a while back went and occupied and invaded, and it's the Commonwealth, and it's nothing to do with the EU, but it's being played as a sort of anti-EU, anti-recent EU migrant story. So there's this kind of swirl of total nonsense about that, and I do think it's worthwhile, although I suspect this isn't how you end up winning the argument in immigration. I do think it's worthwhile just cutting through with what is available of the research that is out there, because people do bother to go and look at what impact migration is actually having on the economy. And probably the principal 3 you want to go through are, first, the idea that recent migrants, I'm talking particularly here, people from Eastern Europe, after the expansion of the EU in 2004, and then again with the de-restriction of movement over the last year and a bit further back to 2007 for Bulgaria and Romania, that people arriving here and basically turning up to claim our oh-so-generous benefits. Now, first of all, anybody who is having to claim our oh-so-generous benefits will pretty rapidly realise that they're not really oh-so-generous at all, and they're becoming increasingly less generous. The prospect of upping sticks and travelling from one end of the Europe to the other to try and sit in the job centre and persuade the person grilling you that you have in fact been diligently looking for work over the last week in order to get the pittance they actually give you for JSA is not particularly, lo and behold, not a particularly appealing one. But if you look at the figures here, it turns out, and there's a careful and good bit of research by a bunch of researchers at University College London, just down the road, who bothered to look at the contribution that people have been making in terms of how much they paid in taxes and the benefits, both in kind, so are they using the NHS, are they sending their children to school, that sort of thing, and in terms of directly money that they're getting over the last 10 years, 2001 to 2011, the data they've got runs to, and basically the net contribution, taking into account of how much money people are taking out of the system, using the NHS, claiming benefits, all that sort of stuff, taking into account how much they're paying in taxes, the net contribution of recent migrants was 20 billion over that period of time. So that's 20 billion pounds that migrants, recent migrants from the rest of Europe have contributed directly in taxes, over and above whatever they're claiming in benefits of one sort or another. The reason for this is pretty obvious, is that the people who move tend to be young and looking for and going for work. And if you're young and mobile and looking for work, lo and behold, you're not old and likely to be ill and therefore asking to use the NHS and asking to claim benefits of one sort or another. This just doesn't happen. You're actually working and you're going to be paying taxes. So of course there's a net benefit out of all of this. That's leaving aside, of course, the fact that if you just go into any number of our various public services, the NHS being the outstanding example, and think through just how much it relies on migrant labour, then you can see straight away, very directly, the kind of contribution that recent migrants in particular are making here. And I'm just going through this because I think even on a kind of, if you like, this sort of centre ground basis, the kind of nonsense that's coming out around migration needs at least challenging on a factual basis, on the basis of the best research we have. The research also suggests in particular, the place to look for this has prepared a very good series of briefings and summaries of the research available from the Oxford Migration Observatory, is that there is no real impact on unemployment of those already resident from recent migration over the last 10 years or so to the UK. No real impact. Now, this is a little bit, might seem slightly counterintuitive, although maybe not. Really what's happening here is if people move to this country, they're not moving speculatively. They're not moving to just sit around hoping somebody will give them a job at some point. They're moving because there's a definite offer of work, otherwise you don't make the move. It's actually quite a long way to go. It's expensive, so you don't do it unless you can get a job, which means you don't have much impact on unemployment. You're just there to get a job one way or the other. What's happening here in addition is that because of the distribution of where work is being created in this country, alongside this migration from across Europe, there's also an enormous internal migration. The way that London is gradually sucking every single young person in the entire country into itself, or something along those lines, over the last few years is quite extraordinary. Again, if you look at the bit of research from Centre for Cities that shows the net gain in London of migration from the rest of the country outweighs migration from the rest of Europe over the last 10 years or so. And then, of course, if you look at the figures, you find that between 2010 and 2012, 80% of new jobs created in this country were created in London. So in other words, the movement here isn't just one that there's people from elsewhere arriving and depriving people of jobs here. The movement here is absolutely everyone moving to where the jobs are being created. So it's not having this impact on unemployment that you might anticipate. There is finally this idea that migrants, and you can see, by the way, these two things contradict, that you get them either they're coming here to take our benefits, or they're coming here and undercutting us by working too hard and getting paid not enough. These two things can't both be right, you'll notice. But if you start saying, oh, well, they're obviously pushing down wages, here the evidence is unclear. There's a bunch of research that tends to point towards recent migrants, right? So in particular, over the period 1997 to 2007 or thereabouts, actually had a positive impact on average wages in this country. Findings being about 1% increase in migration gives you about a 0.3% increase in the average wage. The reason for that is because, look, if you have a job, it's not just an isolated thing. It's not just you by yourself doing your work and you get paid and that's that. It's not like this just thing happening by itself. It's that if you have a job, then that means a whole lot of other people are doing work that is associated with that job. In other words, these things are complementary. If you, to pick the example that always gets picked out, if you go and work in Pret, right, and you're there selling sandwiches, for you to sell sandwiches, there's a whole load of people who need to deliver the ingredients to that shop. There's a whole load of people who need to prepare the ingredients, a bit further down the line. You selling sandwiches here means that somebody else gets a job back there. So in other words, these things complement. In other words, there's potential for wages to increase. Some other bits of research, again, over the same period of time, find that perhaps there was an ever so slight negative impact, again, about 0.3% decrease in wages. So the evidence is contradictory here. But that's the point. The point being is that really there's no particular impact of migration on wages of people here. It could go this way, it could go that way. That if you're talking about the recent decline in real wages and real salaries, which is now 6 years, and it just hasn't really improved. 6 years of continual falling real wages, so the amount of money people have after you take account of inflation, has fallen and fallen and fallen for most people for 6 years. It's the longest sustained decline in living standards for most people, really since records began. There's nothing that truly compares to this. Not the Great Depression, not the, not the interwar years in general, not the First Great Depression, the 1870s. It's worse than all of that. This is the worst period of decline since records began. It can't be due to migration alone. In fact, it isn't due to migration, because the period of the increase in migration, which is the 2000s, is a period where wages are going up, and then migration is still increasing, but now wages are going down. So in other words, when wages go up, migration's increasing. When wages are going down, migration's increasing. It could go either way. There's no impact here. It's not right to say that a whole bunch of people coming from the rest of Europe coming here is pushing down wages. That is not what's taking place. What's really going on here, and what this should tell you, is that the fault is far bigger. A much more dramatic thing has happened, which is that this is a major crisis of capitalism that we went through in 2008, that we live in a kind of capitalism that is really very weak. I mean, the government tries to talk this up, really very weak, on a whole load of obvious things that capitalism ought to be doing, the principal one of which is that if you're a capitalist, you ought to be investing. What British capitalists do very, very little of, relative to other developed countries, is actually invest at all. They may have all this money. Profits, by the way, are reaching record levels at this point in time. And yes, there is a direct correlation between people being paid less and less and profits increasing. Profits are at record levels, but they're not investing that profit. They're not turning it into factories, machineries, and this sort of thing. They're instead relying on the fact that we have labour markets which are weak in general, which in general have trade unions that are being battered and do not move, that we have governments that will allow the creation of things like zero-hour contracts, incredibly insecure work, that we have, over the last few years, this extraordinary increase in self-employment, in people dropping out of conventional employment, where you have an employer, there is some degree of protection, and being pushed into this kind of netherworld of self-employment. At the same time, by the way, that self-employed wages have dropped by about 22% in the last 3-4 years or so. It's a real bottom falling out of the market there. That they are relying on the fact, our capitalists, who should be, this is what's supposed to happen, they should be investing their profits in order that they build factories, machineries, go out and generate more profits. It's kind of what should happen. They're not doing that. To nothing like the extent of capitalists in France or Germany or the US or Japan or wherever you happen to mention of that kind of group of countries. They're not doing that, and instead relying on the fact they can get away with just paying people less and less and less over time. And as far as they're concerned, it really doesn't matter where you come from, as long as they can get away with paying you less. That's the mechanism that's going on here. So we live in this weak, battered form of capitalism, in which we have a ruling class that doesn't invest, that is basically lazy, feckless, useless, that given the opportunity to spend its money and invest its money in London property or in financial speculation, would rather do that than start to try and generate real investment that might provide stable jobs and all the rest of it. And that's where the fault lies. And to deal with that problem of low investment, to deal with that problem, it's a historic problem for Britain really, but it's become chronic, I think, in the last few years. To deal with that problem, they're expecting the rest of us simply to work harder for less, for longer hours, in increasingly insecure conditions. That's the issue here. It's not to do with movements of people across Europe. That's a symptom, if you like. At best, it's a symptom of the kind of capitalism we have. It is not itself the cause of unemployment, falling wages, nor is it the case that people moving across Europe are a direct drain on the public purse here in any sense. So that's just a deal, I hope, with the kind of myths that you get about immigration, the principal kind of economic ones. That the fault here lies with the kind of capitalism we live under. It does not lie with the kinds of people turning up and basically looking for work and making a contribution. And I think we have to be absolutely clear about this, that it is not good enough at all, in any circumstances, for people in particular in the Labour Party to start trying to ape a sort of Ukip or Ukip-light kind of line. So that's one part of it. The second bit is that if you actually start to seriously think through the counterfactual, if you like. I mean, let's do a sort of Nigel Farage fantasy that suddenly he's Prime Minister, I mean, God help us, but suddenly he's Prime Minister, right? So then you say, OK, we're going to, what's his name? Reckless, standing in Rochester and Stroud, who's just come out today with at least hinting that, one of the things we can do if we're in the EU is basically get rid of all these Poles who are here. It's a kind of repatriation sort of language that's starting to creep back in here. Think through the consequences of this one. There are 2.3-ish million people from the rest of the EU living in this country. There are 2.3 million Brits living in the rest of the EU. Now, if we start chucking people out of this country, what's going to happen to the million odd, mostly pensioners living in Spain? Do you think they're going to stay in Spain? No, of course not. They all come back here. The whole thing is kind of nonsensical. It's nonsensical on several different levels. That if you say, all right, here we are, we're just going to stop immigration, does that immediately mean